Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Mary, and today's video is going to be my January reading wrap-up.
I should have told you that I loved you one more time.
In the month of January, I actually read a lot more than I thought I would. I'm pretty excited about that. January, if you don't know, I'm a full-time law student, so it was my first month back in school, going to school in person, since lockdown started in March. But a couple things happened. So I had the first 11 days of January without any school, which I knew I would have. So all I had was some stuff that I had to work on for moot court. So I had a lot of time to read the first 11 days. But then towards the end of my winter break, my boyfriend actually tested positive for COVID. He must have got it from someone he works with. And I never tested positive, but I did have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So I couldn't go back to class in person right away. I had to wait an extra week and a day. But that afforded me even more reading time. So I did, like I mentioned, end up reading 16 books. Actually, did I already mention that? I don't know. This is the second time I filmed this video, so, because I messed up my stats last time, so we're starting over. But I did read 16 books in the month of January. I read 5,109 pages, which is an average of 165 pages, give or take, per day, which is pretty incredible, in my opinion, for myself. It's a lot. I read a lot this past month, which was really exciting. I read from authors from 5 different countries, including the US, Canada, Britain, the Philippines, and North Korea, which is pretty cool. And I did read 1 book from the 19th century, 2 books from the 1960s, 1 book that was published in 2000, 1 book that was published in 2012, 1 book that was published in 2014, 1 book that was published in 2015, 4 books that were published in 2017, 1 book that was published in 2018, 2 books that were published in 2019, and 2 books that were published in 2020. I read from 12 female and 4 male authors, and I read from 9 white authors, 3 black authors, 3 Asian authors, and 3 Latinx authors. I read 6 YA and 10 adult books, no middle grade, no children's, no new adult. I don't know how to really count new adult. I guess if it says new adult, then I'll count it. That's kind of an iffy genre or demographic for me, because I'm not sure quite when it crosses the line, if that makes sense. But I read 6 books physically. I listened to 5 audiobooks, and I read 5 ebooks. And I read 5 nonfiction books this month, 3 contemporaries, 2 romance, 2 science fiction, 1 thriller, 1 general fiction, 1 fantasy, and 1 classic. I gave 0 1-stars, 1 2-star, 3 3-stars, 8 4-stars, and 4 5-stars. So that's an average of 3.9 stars, which is kind of insane. Not really. It would be insane if it was a 4-star or above, I guess. But my average star rating is like a 3.2 to a 3.5. So it was pretty good. I had a really good reading month, both quantity and quality-wise with what I read. But without further ado, I'm just going to walk you through these 16 books that I read. Because I read so many, I don't want this video to be an hour long. I'm just going to start in order, in the order in which I read them, and tell you what each one is about, what I rated it, and anything else significant that sticks to mind. So the first thing is I finished in Extremis, which I believe was on my November TBR. So I've had this out from the library for a long, long time, but this is the, what's the word? The biography of the war correspondent, Marie Colvin. She was a war correspondent for the Sunday Times in London. And she was specifically the Middle Eastern war correspondent. So this book does deal a little bit with her childhood and adolescence and sort of her college experience and her original working when she worked for a newspaper company in New York, and then she worked for a news company in DC, and then she moved to France, and that's sort of what kickstarted her foreign correspondence career. But it also goes into some of the really big conflicts that she covered and some of the really big moves and important things that she did for, what's the word that I'm looking for here? Some of the big things that she did as far as journalism goes. I don't know what I'm trying to say with that, but this book also does something that I love, and another book that I talked about does this too. It has pictures in it. So you can see pictures of her as a child, and then it has pictures of her as she grows up, and pictures of her that relate to stories that are told in this book from the perspective of friends and family, etc. I like photographs in my nonfiction, especially memoirs and biographies. I think they're very helpful and very they make it feel real. Like, obviously this is a nonfiction book, it's a true story, it is real, but it makes it just that much more real for me. I would recommend this to people who are interested in foreign correspondence. I ended up giving this 4 stars. The only thing that this book felt a little voyeuristic at times, because the author, who I believe was a close friend of Colvin, tends to cover her relationships, and some of her relationships, romantic relationships, are they're very dramatic, and they're a little traumatic as well. So that felt kind of weird, hearing about the types of things that went on in her personal relationships, which I get that it's a biography and that's a part of her life, so it's important that it was in there, but it did feel strange to read about, if that makes sense. The other thing that I really appreciated about this book is that it's got a lot of different conflicts involved in it, and a lot of the things in this are from the 80s and the 90s, when I was a child or not born yet. And so the author did a good job, I thought, of providing context for those conflicts and for what was going on and why certain things were important and who certain important players were. That I'd heard of certain people, but I didn't really know anything about them. And I'd heard of certain conflicts, but I wasn't very aware of them because they'd been, a lot of them aren't resolved still, but they're just not as present in the Western world today. So the next book that I read, keeping up with nonfiction / memoirs biographies, is In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. And this book was so good. This is a 5-star read for me, for sure. And this is about Yeonmi Park, who escaped North Korea through sex trafficking in China, and later through getting to South Korea. And now I believe she lives in the US. And she has talks on YouTube where you can listen to her speak about her experiences in North Korea. But she escaped North Korea when she was 13 years old with her mother. And for a long time, she was separated from her older sister, who had escaped months prior. But this basically details her childhood in North Korea, what it was like growing up, sort of what happened to her family to fall from grace in the different, like, it's not a caste system, but there are people who are political enemies of the Kims, who are in charge of North Korea. And so it's about her life growing up in a border town with China, and how she knew of the outside world, but not really, and how she learned about certain things, and then just the experience of being trafficked to China, and then what that meant for her and her mother, and how she had to learn Chinese because her mother couldn't learn it, and she had to learn to speak to all these people, and just about her experiences. This book is phenomenal. It's hard to read at times, but I really do think it's important to read, and I would recommend this to pretty much anybody. So yes, I loved this book, and I would highly recommend it. And sensing a theme, there are also photographs in this one of her family. So this book is so moving and so good. I would highly recommend it. The third book that I read in January was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. I won't go too far into this one because I do have a full review. I'll link it somewhere so you can watch that if you're interested. But this is the classic sci-fi by Philip K. Dick about, it's what Blade Runner is based on, but it is about a bounty hunter, if you will, for androids. And it's set in the near future. It's actually set in January 2021, which is why I wanted to read it this month. But Rick Deckard is a bounty hunter, and he is assigned these 6 androids to take out and exterminate or retire, so that he can get the bounty on their heads, basically. The book is very different from the movie, and I would prefer the book to the movie. The only thing I will touch on for the book is that if you read it thinking it's going to be a quick pace, action-packed book, it has a lot of action, but the way the narrative is told, it's almost more like a noir story or an old school mystery, in that a lot of it is in Deckard's head. And so you're reading this book from his perspective, obviously, and you're reading, it's got a lot of focus on his life and his sort of downtroddenness within his life, and less to do with the actual action of the story. So be wary of that. I ended up giving this 3 stars, but I did enjoy it. It just was not my favorite thing of all time at all, but it is good, and I would recommend it if you are, like me, interested in classic sci-fi. The next book that I read in January was You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. This is a YA contemporary with a little bit of a queer element about Elizabeth, who is a young queer black girl growing up in Indiana, and she lives in this town that is obsessed with prom, and she just wants to play, she wants to go to med school eventually, but she wants to play her instrument in college, in the college orchestra. I believe it's violin, but I can't remember what instrument she plays now, which I feel terrible about. Is it flute? I don't remember. It's been a while since I've read this, but some of her financial aid to pay for college falls through, and so she decides to run for prom, because the winner of the prom queen gets a scholarship I think, or just wins a cash prize. I don't really remember at this point. But this book was really cute. I really enjoyed it. I did give it 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it if you are interested in that kind of thing. I think it was really good. The next book that I read was When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrisse Cullors. I just want to note that I did end up listening to this as an audiobook, and the audiobook that I listened to was the version that was either edited or rewritten for YA audiences. And this is about Patrisse Cullors. It's her memoir. And Patrisse Cullors is one of the founding members of the Black Lives Matter movement. So the book is about her growing up in Southern California as a Black woman. She's queer, and she talks a lot about growing up queer, growing up Black, growing up in how she was in a primarily Latinx neighborhood and what that meant for her and her Black and brown friends, and how at some point she ended up getting bused to a primarily white school and how her experiences were different from theirs. This book focused a lot on her childhood and high school experiences, and thinking about that now, it makes sense. I didn't get it while I was reading it. I thought it was going to be more about her adult life, and it definitely does get there, but a lot of it is about her childhood and growing up and her adolescence, and maybe the adult version of this book is the same, but I think probably, now that I'm thinking about it, the reason that it focuses on her life in high school and discovering herself that way is probably because it's written for high schoolers. Now that I'm thinking, that makes sense now that I'm like actually putting it together. But this book was really great. I would recommend it. It was not hard to listen to. And by that I mean that she has an easy way of speaking. The narrator does a good job. I don't know who narrated it, or I thought it was her, but I could be completely wrong about that. But yes, I did really enjoy this. She also does eventually go into her political activism. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. I thought it was going to be a book about her political activism, and it's more about her life, which makes sense because it's a memoir. It just wasn't quite what I thought it was going to be a memoir about, if that makes sense. But she does talk a lot about her older brother. Monty was arrested and has, I'm going to mess it up now. I don't know if it's BPD or some other, or like he has mental health issues. And she talks about the reaction of police to Black men with mental health issues and how big of a problem that is in our society. And that's one of the reasons she started founding, or she helped start the Black Lives Matter movement, is because she watched her brother Monty be arrested and be harassed and be beat by the police because they didn't know what to do with a Black man who had mental health issues. So I did really enjoy that book. I do think I was looking for a book about political activism more than I was looking for a memoir, but read what you get, I guess. Then I read Always and Forever Lara Jean by Jenny Han. This is the final book of the To All the Boys I've Loved Before series, so I won't spoil too much. I am planning on doing a vlog or a video about my thoughts on that book compared to the movie that's going to come out this month, which I'm really, really excited about. But if you don't know, To All the Boys I've Loved Before is the story of Lara Jean Covey, who is a junior in high school, and she has this quirky habit, I guess, where every time she has a crush on a boy, she writes him a love letter and puts it in her hat box. And at the beginning of the first book, her love letters get out. And so the boys that she's had a crush on all these years find out that she liked them. And then she has to fake date one of them so that the boy that she likes now doesn't find out that she likes him. And it's just this cute little romance story between her and Peter Kavinsky, one of the boys in the letters. So the books go on from there, and there's other conflicts. Like in the last one, they're about to go to college, and she's trying to figure out what she wants to do basically for the rest of her life. I give this book 5 stars. It made me cry. I found it so relatable. I don't know why, because my life is nothing like Lara Jean Covey's, but it just, like, so much of it was nostalgic for me, I guess. So I did really enjoy this book, and I do think if you like the series, you will really like the conclusion to it, but I don't know. I've heard other people say that they wish it had just been a standalone, and I definitely get that for the second book, but I think the third book is, I think it's pretty good. The next book that I read was The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez, and I give this book 2 stars. This is an adult romance. I can't remember the characters' names now. Kristen is the girl, and I think Brandon is her friend's fiance. I can't remember the guy's name to save my life. I'm sure I'll remember it at some point, but she and this guy, it's like a hate to love type of thing. I just didn't care for it. It's about Kristen, who is trying to plan her best friend Sloane's wedding, and she's the maid of honor, and this other guy is the best man, and they meet, and they sort of butt heads right away, and Kristen has a boyfriend, but he's in the army, and so a lot of it, or he's in the Marines, excuse me, they have this big thing about, like, they're all in the Marines, they're all really into hunting, and, like, I don't know, it wasn't, like, I guess the problem was I don't have to find men in books attractive, but I feel like when you're reading a romance, it helps to, like, like one of the characters or both of the characters or like them together, and I just found myself not caring. The second book, I believe, does follow one of the side characters that I really liked in this book, and I can't tell you who it is because I think it would spoil it, but I knew going into it, and it definitely spoiled it. I did not have an emotional reaction to anything that happened in this book, and I think I would have if I did not know what the second book was about. But it's one of those series where it's a series of standalones, so you can technically read them separately, but the characters cross over. Anyways, I want to read the second book because I like the character that is in it, but I didn't care for any of the characters that were, or the two main characters in the first book, so I didn't really care about the first book, to be honest with you. Also, it like borders on cheating, and I'm not into cheating in my books personally, so it is what it is, I guess. I'm still waiting for the hate to love that I love. I don't know. I hold too many grudges for hate to love to really work for me, I think might be the problem. Then I read The Statistical Probability of Love at First Sight by Jennifer E. Smith. This book is a 24-hour romance following a girl whose name is Hadley. And Hadley is flying to London from Connecticut, I think, to her father's wedding to a woman that she's never met. And so she's dealing with that, and she meets this guy, Oliver, who is flying back to London. He's from London, and he's going for an undisclosed reason, and it's sort of about their like initial bond and then how they keep sort of running into each other and their lives keep intertwining during this 24-hour period. Very cute, very sweet. I gave it 4 stars. Is that correct? Yes. Gave it 4 stars, flew through it. The font is pretty big in this book, and it's YA, so I didn't know how I was going to feel about it being a 24-hour thing, but it didn't feel like insta-love because you follow them for the whole 24 hours, and it's just like a crush developing. And I think that's a relatable thing that I can relate to, obviously, because I said it's relatable. What am I talking about? But yes, I did really enjoy this. This is just a book that my boyfriend brought home from his house that I guess was his or his mom's. But yeah, it was very cute. I'm glad I read it. The next book that I read was The Bone Witch by Chupeco. Full disclosure, I listened to this as an audiobook, which I think was a mistake. I could not get into it to save my life. I gave it 3 stars just because I'm gonna continue the series, and I feel like had I been able to really focus on it, I would have enjoyed it more. This basically follows this girl, Tia, who is a bone witch, or, she's a witch, and her powers involve necromancy, which is really disliked in her, like, hometown community, but she gets whisked away by another bone witch to a larger city where they're going to teach her how to hone her skill, and their magic has something to do with dancing and song, which I didn't really get, and one of their jobs is to, like, entertain people in tea houses. This is definitely, like, Asian inspired, like South Asian or East Asian inspired. The writer is from the Philippines, but I just didn't get it. I feel like, I don't know if it was because I was listening to it and not reading it that I didn't really understand. It also follows 2 timelines. One when Tia is like 16 or 17 and she's sort of living on her own and she's been ostracized and doing something kind of shady. And then the other timeline is her telling her story of how she developed her powers, found out she had powers, and then sort of what happened to her when she was in training. I'm going to continue the series, and I'm going to read a synopsis before I read the next book, but I'm taking a break from it for right now because I don't think I can listen to another one as an audiobook, and I just don't really have any desire to continue in it right at this moment. But I did give it 3 stars. I might change that to 2. I haven't decided. But yeah, I just thought it was too confusing, and I don't read this as an audiobook, or don't listen to this as an audiobook, is the advice that I would give you if you're interested in it. Then I read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is another classic sci-fi. I, however, would consider this more fantasy. So I found thinking of this as sci-fi to be confusing, and if I thought of this as fantasy, I liked it more. And what I mean by that is, for my sci-fi, I prefer science fiction that is based in hard science elements, or like concepts of physics, things that could rationally happen, and I don't feel like this book had enough of a backbone in hard sciences for me to really look at it that way and enjoy it that way. But it does involve like a separate planet and like a made up people on that planet, and so for that reason I thought it was better seen as a fantasy. I did talk about this book pretty thoroughly in a vlog that I did, so I will link that somewhere because I don't have time to really get into it, but this is considered feminist fiction. And one of the biggest concepts of this book is that it's about this guy, Genli, who is an envoy to a planet called Gethin, and on Gethin, everyone is ambisexual, which means that they don't have any biological sex and they don't have a gender. And so that's very interesting, and it also goes in depth on how that has sort of affected their society. They don't have any war, they don't have any like conflict between nations, and it's almost hypothesized that that could be because of the lack of a masculine a solely masculine like section of the population, if that makes sense, because everyone is a little masculine and a little feminine, and it doesn't really matter. It also talks about how Genli doesn't really talk about, but it alludes to the fact that Genli is extremely misogynistic in his description of anything that's not masculine from these Gathenians. He finds disgusting and revolting and backwards, which is very interesting, and it's an interesting way to go about it. But this basically follows Genli as he's trying to convince the king of the different societies on Gethin to join Hainish, what's it called? It's like the UN, but for the galaxy. I can't remember the name of it right now. But it's basically like, from what I understand, a peace alliance between different planets in this solar system, galaxy, etc. I don't know the right word for it. But this was really good. This is book 4 in the Hainish cycle. And I am planning on reading the entire Hainish cycle and then coming back to this when I get to it. This is the first Ursula K. Le Guin that I've read. But I did briefly keep up with people's thoughts when they were doing, it was like Beck in the Books, Ashley from Frolic Through Fiction, and Jade from JD Rereads are the people that I know did it, but they were doing that Le Guin along, I think, and they read her other fantasy series about the magic school, and apparently a lot of those books focus on travel, and this book has a large section of it that is just travel over ice, because this is an icy planet, and that was my least favorite part of this book. I gave this book 3.5 stars in my notes, but I rounded it up to 4 stars on Goodreads. I didn't hate this book. I enjoyed it quite a lot, and I really enjoyed the ideas, and it's very thought-provoking to me. I still think about it now, which is why I gave it 4 stars, but overall, was not my favorite, but I do think if I read it a second time, I would get a lot more out of it. Then I read Norco 80 by Peter Houlihan. This book I put on my November TBR for Nonfiction November. January should have been Nonfiction November. I read 5 nonfiction books this month, but this is a true crime book about a bank robbery that took place in Norco, California in 1980. Again, in my most recent vlog, I go into a lot of details on this book, so I'll keep it brief here. But this book, basically, half of it follows the bank robbery and subsequent car chase that occurred, and the other half covers the court case afterwards and the effect that had on police in the United States. So this book is really, really interesting if you are interested in learning more about that. However, if you are looking at this book, the most interesting part of this book was barely in it, in my opinion. I gave this book 3 stars, I think. 3 stars, that's what I thought. I gave this book 3 stars. There's nothing wrong with it. I just thought it was a little too long, and I didn't enjoy the author's extreme bias as much as I, like to have. I felt like it was well researched, but it also felt like he only put in facts that were good for his side of his bias, if that makes sense. He just throws in at the end that police are not militarized, and that's cool. And I don't know, I wish that there had been more deep diving into that concept, if that makes sense. I said this in my blog as well, but I would like to read a book about the militarization of the police that covers this case, but also the broader consequences and both positive and negative that have come from that. Then I read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and I gave this 4 stars. I was surprised at how much I really enjoyed this, but this is a classic. It's the only book that Emily Bronte ever wrote, and it is about basically Heathcliff, and he has this hard childhood where he is adopted to this family. He's been orphaned and he's adopted to this family, and he has this sort of love affair with Catherine Earnshaw from this family, and she ends up marrying their neighbor, and he's a very jealous man, he being Heathcliff, and Heathcliff ends up buying the whole estate, so he owns all of the property. And it's kind of, I thought this was going to be a book about Heathcliff's romance with Catherine, and that's just not what it's about. It's about revenge, is what I would say. But I really enjoyed the way that Bronte was able to explore the different themes of the different kinds of love that we can have for people. And she also focuses a lot on classism at the time. I did really enjoy this book, like I mentioned. And what I thought was really fun is the whole book is told from the perspective pretty much of the new neighbor who's moved in, and he has the housekeeper who has been there since Heathcliff was a kid. So she's an old lady who's been with these families forever, and she's basically just telling him all the drama of what's gone on and why people are the way that they are, which is really helpful because, first of all, you get the whole story in chronological order for the most part, which is, I always find that helpful. And also what I liked about it is that you get to see Nellie Dean's bias. Nellie Dean is my favorite character. I love Nellie Dean. I'm a big Nellie Dean fan. But once you understand that she has opinions about these people, you sort of start to read it less as this is actually what happened and more as this is her interpretation of what happened, and especially less to do with what is actually said and what is done and more to do with like the way she's describing the way people are saying things and the way they're doing things and their motives, because she has her biases, if that makes sense. But I really liked Wuthering Heights, and I would recommend it. If you like a classic, I think it's a good one. Then I read what is the shortest book that I read this month, and also my favorite book that I read this month, Brother by David Chariandy. I bawled in this book. This is about a young man named Michael, and we have two timelines. There's the present timeline where he's in his 30s and he's living with his mom, and his older brother is gone, and we're not sure exactly where his brother has gone or what has happened to his brother. We just know that his brother is not around anymore, and old neighbors are sort of coming back to their life. They live in this place called Scarborough Park in Canada, which I believe is a suburb of Toronto. Again, I don't know if that's right. I'm not from Canada, but this book is about dealing with grief and forgiving people and just like the trauma of, I feel like there's a big part of this book that I feel like is a spoiler to say, because this book is so short, but basically the second timeline is back in time describing sort of what happened in the lead up to Francis no longer being around, and just it was like growing up in this neighborhood. And they live in a poor neighborhood that is full of people of color and immigrants, and crime starts happening on the outskirts of their neighborhood, and throughout the past timeline, the crime is getting closer and closer and closer and closer to home. And I think that's the best way to describe it, really. But I loved this book. If you have 192 pages worth of mental capacity for it, I would highly recommend it. Then I listened to Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. Quite the opposite of that. This is a book that is kind of a memoir and kind of just like a collection of funny vignettes of like kitchen life. So it's a little bit about why Anthony Bourdain decided to be a chef and different restaurants that he's worked in and stuff like that. But it's also a lot of like tips and tricks on like how he has a whole chapter called like how to cook like a professional chef, where he just gives you like tips for the types of ingredients to buy, and and like tips for the tools you can use in your kitchen that will make you a better cook. And it's hilarious, but definitely if you are the type of person who doesn't like cursing or vulgarity or anything like that, it's not for you. It's very vulgar, it's very crude, it's got a lot of cussing, but I just thought it was really funny and exactly what I needed. I also listened to it as an audiobook, which I would recommend because the late, great Anthony Bourdain narrates the audiobook, which makes it a joy to get through. I read You by Caroline Kepnes, which I shockingly gave 5 stars. So I love this TV show. I've already seen the first 2 seasons of it. The book is pretty different from the TV show, and the main way that they differ is that in the TV show, Joe is given more positive attributes than he is in the book, and more positive motivations. So this is about Joe. You're inside of Joe Goldberg's head. Joe works at a bookstore, and one day this girl, Guinevere Beck, comes into his bookstore, and he develops a crush on her and then starts stalking her. And I think what's the most interesting to me about this book is that every character in here is normal, pretty much. I mean, Joe's obviously not normal because he's stalking her and he's kind of like psychotic, but because you're in his head, it feels normal. And then Beck, you are watching him obsess over her and think she's so great, and she'll do certain things and he's like, I can tell that she wants me. I know you want me. It's not she wants me, it's you, because it's all written in second person, which makes it so much creepier and scarier. But what's scary about this book is that Beck isn't perfect. She's not amazingly like way more beautiful than other people. She's not way smarter than other people. She's not way cooler than other people. She's kind of a phony, and she's kind of flaky, and she's just like got her own issues, and like she just doesn't seem like the type of person who someone would obsess over, which makes it scarier because it's like anyone could be the type of person that someone obsesses over, if that makes sense. But I really like this movie. It was very scary. Or this book. What am I saying? I really like this book. I found it very scary, and I found it very like creepy, eerie, any word that you can use in that like vein, it was. So if you like a thriller, I think you would really like this. Even if you have seen the show, if you didn't like the show, you probably wouldn't like it. But if you've seen the show and you liked it, I think this is the like bones of the book are the same, but the details are different, and I think you would enjoy it for that, if that makes sense. This is so good. And I think the reason that they changed some of Joe's actual like character traits in the show is that it's harder to root for a TV character the way you root for a book character. because like in the book you can be in his head, so you're not really rooting for him, but you like kind of are because you're inside of him, so you are him while you're reading this. But in the show, it's harder to like portray that, so they had to make him a little more likable, I think. But phenomenal. I would recommend either. If you don't want to read the book, I would watch the show because it's great. If you don't want to watch the show, read the book. I would highly recommend doing both. I love both of them. And then the last thing that I read in the month, see my light's coming through weird because I've been talking for too long. The last thing that I read for the month of January was The Nowhere Girls by Amy Reed, and I gave this 4 stars. And what I will say about this book is I would not just generally recommend this to everybody because I think it does have a specific audience. This is a YA hard-hitting contemporary about a group of girls who start calling themselves the Nowhere Girls, and they're trying to combat rape culture in their school. So it starts with Grace, who moves to the school from Georgia, and she basically was ostracized at her old school because her mom used to be a really conservative Christian. Like, you can't be a pastor in the Baptist church if you're a woman, apparently, according to this book, but she worked at a church and did some sort of ministering there, and now she works at a different church in Oregon where they've moved, but it's a much more liberal church because she sort of had like a change of heart about her conservative ways, I guess. And then Erin is a young girl with Asperger's who is sort of trying to figure out her whole life. And there's some stuff in her past and whatever, but I'm not going to get into it because I don't want to spoil it for you. And then there's Rosina. Is that her name? I feel bad. I listened to this as an audiobook too, so I don't even remember how their names are spelled. But she's from a family of Mexican immigrants, and she's a lesbian, and so she's dealing with both of those things. And these girls become unlikely friends, and they bond over, that sounds bad, but they sort of bond over the new girl moving into the house of a girl who moved away because she was gang raped, and nobody believed her. And so definitely, if you are going to be triggered by talks of sexual assault, talks of anything like that, I would not read this book. I just wouldn't. If that's going to really affect you, I would definitely look into the content warnings for this book. I think that's super important. But if you can handle that kind of thing, I thought it was really good. I will agree with negative reviews that it is not super realistic, both in the way that things are handled by like the bad cops and by the good cops and by the teachers. I don't think anything was handled the way that it would have been handled in public schools, but I did think it was an empowering read. And I do think it's an important read for especially young girls to know that you can take control of your destiny. And I also liked that it gave a wide variety of responses to what people go through when they experience an assault, and also how young girls especially react to sex and things of that nature, which I think is super important to explore in YA, just because I think it's good for girls to have their first experience, and boys, and anybody, to have their first experience reading about sex and like coming in contact with it in a way that empowers them and makes them feel safe. And I think that this book could be a tool for that, if that makes sense. But I have to go now because this lighting is getting worse and worse. Okay, I'm really close to the side of this now because everything is awful, but I'm gonna go. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you would like to, you can go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I do post at least one video a week, usually more than that, whenever I can at this point. I post every Sunday and then whenever I can in between then. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!
I should've told you that I loved you.